And welcome everyone to this webinar. Thank you for joining us. We're just letting people into the virtual room. So just while we do that, welcome. My name's Fussy Kurushi. I'm the General Manager for Informa Connect Academy. It's a pleasure to have you all joining us today. Just while we wait for a few more people to come through the virtual doors, if I could get you to do a favor for me. If you could message in your chat box where you're coming from, that would be, it's always nice to know where in the world we've got our attendees for this webinar. So, and we'll go through and we'll do some shout outs just while we're waiting for the room to fill up. So if you can let me know, that's great to know. In the meantime, I will let you know where I'm from. I'm in Sydney today. I've got Andrew, who is in Byron, so he's probably in a nicer part of Australia than I am. So, and then we've got Jessica, who's coming from us in Mexico City. So a very global audience for sure. I've got, who do we have? We've got someone from Perth in WA, Biswa Jyoti. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Welcome. Thank you for coming in. Hello, Sarah from Sydney. Nice to have you. Thank you so much. We've got Paula from Central Coast. Hello, Lisa from Singapore. Jacinta from Adelaide. Welcome. Let's see what else have we got. We've got a few more people coming in. It's coming in fast. We've got Jacqueline from Kingaroy, Brad from Melbourne. Welcome. Ria from Hobart. Owen from Perth. We're all over Australia and international at this point, so that's fantastic. We might just give it another 10-15 seconds just to allow for everyone to come in, and then we'll kickstart this webinar. I'm hoping everyone's doing well. It's a lovely day here in Sydney, and we've just been discussing the weather in Mexico City as well, which it seems like it's also a nice 28 degrees or 60 Fahrenheit for those playing at home. So yeah. All right, so I think that should give us enough time. I think we've got a healthy audience, and I'm sure they'll keep trickling in. But first of all, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Fussy Kurushi. I am the General Manager for Informa Connect Academy. It's my great pleasure to have Andrew and Jessica joining us for this webinar relating to the Leadership Code, how to adapt, empower, and elevate your team. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we do kick off, and I hand it over to Andrew. These are the two most common questions we always get when we do these webinars, so I'll address those right at the top of this webinar. First of all, this webinar will be recorded, and you will have access to the recording post-webinar. And also there will be a Q&A section, so you can hold your fire and keep your questions to the end. We will try and get through as many of those as we possibly can, so we're looking forward to that. Last thing is that, as you can appreciate, that there is going to be training that we will be delivering around situational leadership. So we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. So do keep an eye out for that. We've got a special offer for those attending the webinar today. But without further ado, it is my great pleasure to hand over to Andrew. Andrew is a very long-standing partner that delivers a lot of our leadership training courses for us. He is an expert in leadership and amongst many other things. And joining us is Jessica, who's a master trainer with the Center for Leadership Studies. And like I said, she's coming in from Mexico. So thank you both for your time. I really appreciate you joining us, and I'll hand it over to Andrew.
Thank
Andrew,
you.
over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Fussy, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. It's great to see we've got such a large, diverse group from right across Australia. I think every state and territory is mentioned there, and also a few from Southeast Asia, so welcome you all. So first up, just a little bit about myself. As Fussy said, I've been working with Informa Connect for nearly 20 years now, off and on. I've run leadership programs. I've been working in adaptive leadership, culture change, working with executive teams to develop aligned leadership teams, etc. And for the last few years, very much around executive presentation skills, how to lift that communication skill to the next level. Also, probably relevant to our conversation here today, I might just share one recent experience. I led a team of 6 facilitators in an organizational-wide culture change program a few years ago now. The change was focused on safety, which is interesting because it doesn't require technical skills, and the focus was actually more on shifting mindsets getting people to change their mindsets around how to deal with this. The program was very successful. It went for about 3 years. We developed a lot of work around authentic leadership, getting the leaders to find their own way of leading and be authentic with that. But what we realized at the end, and there was something missing. And it was only when I really got involved with situational leadership that I realized what it was. And that was that there wasn't a consistent brand of leadership across the organization. Yes, we want individuals to find their own authentic voice. We do want that. But we need a consistent brand, because across this organization, we trained over 350 supervisors, managers, leaders, and executive leaders. And they all had slightly different approaches. Some were very hands-on, some were less hands-on, and it created a lot of confusion in the workplace. So one of the objectives today will be to have a look at how do we create a uniform brand of leadership that everyone can relate to. So with that said, let me just share our objectives here for the session: to learn how to adapt your leadership style to meet the needs of your team members, to discover how to empower your team without micromanaging or losing control, learning how to elevate your leadership impact by building trust, gaining some practical tools that you can use immediately. So our hope is at the end of this session that you'll be able to walk away with a few practical tools to use immediately. I did a bit of research on this recently. What are the most common leadership issues that come up in Australia and Southeast Asia? And managing diverse teams is obviously a big one there. And whether those teams are geographically diverse, culturally diverse, or generationally diverse, we're all now having to deal with this, how to adapt to meet this challenge of diversity. This idea of balancing control with autonomy. We want people to have as much autonomy as possible because we're all too busy to be micromanaging. But if we take our hands off, we can lose a sense of control. Dealing with resistance to change, right? I know a lot of people saying, can I keep up with this constant demand for change? Building trust and psychological safety, absolutely critical. I think most of us would recognize that the foundation for all teamwork is trust. Absolutely critical. And this idea of creating psychologically safe workplaces where people feel safe to experiment, to take risks is critically important. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, developing a consistent leadership brand. The leadership challenge or leadership problem. 3 things here that I just want to set up before I hand over to Jessica. This idea that one size fits all, and this idea that as a leader, I need people to appreciate my style. I have a style, an authentic style of leadership, and everyone just has to fit into that. Well, clearly that does not work with diversity. We need to be adaptable. We need to be able to adjust our style to meet the needs of the audience. And in fact, I would say that's one of situational leadership's great strengths, is empowering leaders with the ability to adapt their style to meet the needs of the learner. And I think it's a really good focus too, that we take the focus off our skill ourselves. What do I need to do in order to get the results I'm after? And shift it a bit more to, well, who am I leading? What are their needs? And how can I adapt myself to meet those needs to achieve the results that we're all after? We're going to look at this balance of micromanaging and hands-off leadership. And a big focus of this is on exactly that issue. How to create a safe zone for people where they're getting the right amount of support. And finally, this idea of getting square pegs to fit into round holes. This idea that for a lot of leaders, it's we need everyone to meet our style, and we can kind of get almost like hammering people into a round hole sometimes. We need to find a way to adapt that. So that said, we're going to run a little poll here. Imran, would you like to just set the poll up, please? We'd like to hear from you because we're wanting to respond to your needs. We're looking for your questions. But if we could just run this quick poll here. What's your biggest leadership challenge as a leader? And can I just give you 20 seconds to read those 3? Just select one. Got about 40% done. 60% done. Right, just another 10 seconds, please. We're up to 80%. Great. We're already seeing some pretty big patterns building there. So we're at about 88%. 10 seconds, we're going to shut the poll down. All right, Imran, we'll close it there, thanks. So we've got a clear winner there. 58% of you said that struggling to balance hands-on, hands-off. Wonderful, you're in the right place. We had 29, nearly 30% difficulty adapting to different team members, and 13% on building trust and engagement. So thank you for that. That's very helpful for us. We'll be able to focus our attention on your issue there of struggling to define this balance. One last slide before I hand over to Jessica here. And I'd like to just walk you through a scenario here. Imagine you have a team member. Could be a highly experienced team member. Maybe it's someone relatively new. And we're delegating a new task to them. So regardless of their background, this is something new. What would happen if we gave them complete autonomy? So I'll just fly an action here. We gave this person, so their ability is relatively low, but we've given them lots of autonomy. Well, we're pretty much setting them up to crash and burn. Clearly, complete autonomy is not going to work for someone with not much skill and ability. And so what happens when people crash and burn is we tend to then micromanage. We might call this, so let's just look at the journey here. So it can look like this a bit for some people. They get undermanaged, they don't get enough support, they make a mistake, and so they get overmanaged or micromanaged, and then they struggle free of that. They get undermanaged and overmanaged. And for some people, this can be this graph could look like a week in learning a new task, and for others, this could be a reflection of their whole career. That with different managers in different organizations, they've had a sense of I've been overmanaged with that person, then undermanaged here, and then overmanaged there, and it feels a little bit chaotic. And so what we want to focus on is this idea of creating a zone of empowerment where people are getting the appropriate amount of support for their level of ability. As their ability improves, we give more autonomy. We pull back on the micromanage. But clearly, at early stages, everyone needs a lot of support. Everybody's going to need a lot of direction, regardless of their experience or skill. When learning a new task, their learning needs will evolve over time. And that's going to be the focus of Jessica's talk here. So Jessica, I'd like to hand over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you everybody for being here. Let me just make sure that I can control the slides. Just give me one sec. Let me just request the control. Sorry about this.
That's okay. We did a lovely test. Have a go now, Jessica. Haven't got it?
Nope.
Okay, well then I'm going to do it for you,
Jessica.
Sorry
about the glitch. So if you can just help me out,
Yep.
Andrew, I'll just have you move the slides when I need them, if that's okay. So Andrew, thank you so much for kicking us off by, having this great conversation. And you brought up an idea which I find fascinating because it's based on conversations that I hear very frequently, which is all about, what's the right style, and do I tend to use more of a directive approach? Do I tend to be more hands-off and try to empower people? And I get this question frequently, but actually we can trace this conversation all the way back to the 50s. And I'll give you a little bit of background of why I'm saying this. Before the 50s, probably there wasn't a lot of conversation happening around leadership in general. And because the world became a more industrialized place, there was this increasing need to replicate leaders. And that really piqued the attention of many brilliant minds, conductual scientists or behavioral scientists, amongst them Dr. Paul Hersey. And what they were trying to find out was, what's that one unique trait, or what's that one unique characteristic, or what's that one unique style that effective leaders have or hold? Because once we can identify this, then we can start replicating leaders. And so if you think about this, the rationale was impeccable. However, things that seem easy at the beginning tend to get a little bit more complicated. And I mean, bear with me, these are the 50s and people are considering all sorts of things. And at one point, people were thinking, this is all about a genetic trait, or it's a personality preference, or it's about their IQ. Like everything was being thrown there in the mix. And amongst like these brilliant minds, as I was mentioning, Dr. Paul Hersey being one of them, I mentioned this name because he's our founder. He's the founder of the Center for Leadership Studies. He's also the creator of the Situational Leadership model, which we're going to be taking a look at. He actually found something that was groundbreaking. And what he found was that there wasn't one unique single style that could do the trick. There wasn't one single unique trait or style that could do, everything for everyone. But rather what he found was leaders are actually effective when they're adaptable, they're flexible. Andrew, you were touching on this. And he identified 4 styles, which we're going to be talking about in a few more minutes now. But he identified these 4 styles, which really represent different behaviors that we use to lead a person based on their needs, but it's needs for a task. And I'll talk to that in a little bit. So when we think about the situational leadership model, this is what came as basically the end product of all of his research. One of the things that we really acknowledge at the center is that the situational leadership model is based on some really solid scientific research. And what came was this practical framework, and I emphasize this word because it's something that we can put into practice right away, and it's something that we can use to lead people on an everyday basis. Now, one of the things that's very unique to our model is that this is what we call a task-specific model. And the reason why we call this a task-specific model is because Dr. Paul Hersey went even further into that research, and he said, you know what? It's not about just addressing the needs of a person, overall needs. It's about addressing the needs of a person for a task. And we can think of task in multiple ways. We can think of skills and activities. We can think of even behaviors. But what we're saying with this is if you think about your everyday, you probably work on multiple tasks, multiple activities, there's multiple expectations, and you probably have very different needs. So when Dr. Paul Hersey created this model, the intention was to be able to lead a person for tasks. And this allows us very kind of easily to dive into everyday leading. And the other thing we say, and it's probably implicit already, but we say this is a performer-driven model, or it's an others-focused model, because another mind-blowing piece or a big mind shift was, this is not about me as a leader and what I want to do and how people should accommodate to me. This is all about other people. And it's other people that are going to be driving my responses as a leader, and it's going to be very specifically for a task. So having said this, Dr. Paul Hersey created this model. What you're seeing is a 2x2 matrix here. And he said there's actually 2 primary behaviors that leaders use in their attempts to influence. And I want to be intentional here in using that word, in their attempts to influence, because the way we define leadership in this context is a person's ability to be able to impact basically somebody else's performance or behavior. And when we say this, we're already eliminating the fact that this is already associated or tied to a role or a position. So for all of you in this webinar, if you're in a place where you're thinking of, hey, I don't know if this is applicable to me. I may not necessarily have direct reports, or I may not necessarily be a manager, or I don't have a fancy title on my card, or maybe I'm thinking this for some of the groups that I work with and they're not all there. Well, it's perfectly okay, because if we think about it in this context and we only think about leadership being influence, it's really applicable to anybody because we all influence on a daily basis. So thinking about some of the people that I work with, I don't have direct reports right now. I used to have direct reports, but it still makes an awful lot of sense to me because I work with my peers and I influence them and clients and my boss, and I manage upwards. And so there's all sorts of contexts in which this model can be applicable. And I'd love for all of you to really think about that context and your challenges, to start making those connections between the content that we're about to see and how it applies to your own context. So think about, I'm looking at these poll questions like the struggling to balance the hands-on and hands-off, or the difficulty adapting to different team members and building trust. Like, think about those circumstances. What do those look like? And how can you make sense of what we're going to be doing, even though this is going to be a high-level overview? Of course, there's only so much we can cover in, the next 15, 20 minutes. I wish we could put everything there that we cover in an 8-hour program, but we unfortunately can't do that. So think about in these at least 20 minutes and in this high level overview, how it connects to your own context. So I was speaking about these two primary sets of behaviors that Dr. Paul Hersey identified. And so here's the first one. Andrew, if you can just help me out, plot it on the x-axis. What you see here on this x-axis is what we call task or directive behavior. In other words, Dr. Paul Hersey said all leaders have to use some degree of what we call task behavior or directive behavior. And you can see here how it ranges from low to high. That's why I was also intentional in saying we use at least some degree. There's never going to be a situation where we don't use at least some. Sometimes we use lower amounts, sometimes we use higher amounts. But let me just define this for you. It's very much intuitive, just based on the name. But when we say task or directive behavior, we mean we're providing structure. We're giving answers to questions like what needs to happen and by when and who's going to be involved and how is this supposed to be shaped? What is it going to look like? Like when we are providing all of these different answers, we're providing that guidance. It's another way of basically saying task or directive behavior. And I just do want to point out, this is not a heavy-handed approach. It's not authoritative. It's not a dictatorship. Like, it's nothing like that. It's just that. It's holding hands. It's making sure that people understand all these areas where they still may be having a lot of questions, especially when we're relatively new to certain tasks. Now, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, if you can plot this for me, Andrew, on the y-axis, we're going to show you the other set of primary behaviors that leaders use. And this is what we call relationship behavior, or the alternative word that we use is supportive behavior. And this is when a leader engages basically a two-way conversation and actively listens. Now, I want to differentiate from the word relationship as we understand it very literally, because this is not about building a relationship. This is just focused on dialogue, if you will. It's when I engage in a conversation with a person and we tap into what are some of their insecurities, or maybe why are they lacking maybe some motivation, or maybe I'm picking their brains, finding out what their ideas are. And so I'm engaging in this conversation or two-way dialogue without this necessarily mean we're friendly or we even have a relationship. Sometimes we don't even have a relationship, or it's not indicative of using higher levels of emotional intelligence or nothing related to that. And again, you're just going to find that it ranges from low to high. And again, this is just one of those situations where we're insisting on there's never going to be a situation where a leader doesn't use at least some degree of relationship behavior or supportive behavior. Now, these two primary behaviors, as you see very graphically, are going to depict 4 leadership styles. I will describe those in a moment. But the reason why we use these 4 leadership styles is because we address the needs of a person for a task. And that's represented on this bottom portion of the slide that you're seeing, this continuum that we call performance readiness. Now, I know that this is not a term that you hear very often, but think about it this way. Think about how ready I am to perform a task. So on the far right, if you can just help me populate this, Andrew, sometimes for a task, my performance is low. And we call that R1, R standing for readiness. And what we're saying here is your overall performance is not low. We're just saying for a task, your performance may be low because it may be new, something that just landed on my desk. I have no idea where to begin. I kind of feel completely in the dark. I don't know what to do with this. So this doesn't represent me in terms of my overall performance. It's not a negative thing. Actually, I consider myself a pretty solid performer. And I know things land on my plate that I don't really know what to do with them unless somebody really holds my hand. So thinking in these terms, another way of seeing performance readiness and for other tasks, my performance sometimes is not low, but it's more like low to moderate. So I'm not completely in the dark. So Andrew, if you could just help me clicking on that one. I'm not completely in the dark. We call this R2 because it represents readiness. That R is representing readiness. It stands for readiness. So we say it's called R2. It's synonymous to saying a person or my performance for a task. I'm not completely in the dark, but I certainly can't run with it. Not quite yet. Maybe I have a conceptual understanding. Maybe I've seen something similar before, but not enough for me to grab the task and run with that task. Now, I certainly know that there's other tasks that I'm working on or that I perform on where my performance is now kind of looking more like moderate to high. And so maybe there's things there where I can still benefit from a little bit of practice, but I'll think of my performance here as R3. So Andrew, again, if you can help me with that click, I say R3, it stands for readiness 3, is where my performance is almost there. I turn the corner. I may still need a little bit of practice. Maybe I have a few insecurities. Maybe I ran into a few problems. I want to discuss these issues, but for the most part, I'm practically there. And then for other tasks, I can probably say for many of the tasks that I perform, my performance is high. So if you can help me with that click, Andrew, this is what we call R4. This is where I'm autonomous, I'm taking charge, I feel very comfortable with the tasks. So it's not representing me again overall. It's the same situation as what we explained with R1. When I'm R4 for a task, it doesn't mean I'm a top performer. It just means for certain tasks, I'm doing a great job. So it eliminates kind of this typecasting of people. And we're going to cover this in the next slide when we start talking about some of the benefits, but we're not putting people in boxes. We're not putting them in certain categories. We're just making a quick assessment. And we actually have a pretty robust process for that. We're not going to cover that right now, but we actually have a pretty robust process so that we understand what the needs of a person are just based on how they're performing or how ready they are to perform a task. Now, from what you're seeing, the leadership response that we need would be very different depending on where I am, right? If I'm autonomous, if I'm taking charge, if I'm doing great for something, I need a sort of response. I probably want to make many of those decisions around the task. What's helpful for me is for the leader to kind of stay out of my way in the good sense of the word. But if I'm struggling, if I don't know what to do, I need a very different approach. I need the leader very much involved. I need probably a lot of hand-holding and some of these things that we mentioned. So let's take a look at what those styles represent or what they look like. So Andrew, if you can help me with the first box, the bottom right corner is going to be representing what we call style 1, or short for this, the abbreviation is S1. And we talk about style 1, just look at where it's placed. This is where, because we're on the right, this is indicative of when a leader is using those higher levels of task behavior, but we're at the bottom, right? So that also means that a leader is probably not engaging in a lot of conversation with me. Now, take a look at this. When I'm using or deciding as a leader to use style 1, it's because I'm matching someone who's R1 for a task. And this is really intuitive. You're going to get it because it's number coded. It's also color coded. So the highest probabilities of me, or the highest probability of me being successful, will come from that leader telling me basically what we do. So if you can help me with the click, Andrew, this is the word that captures the essence of what we do in style 1. We have different words that work here, and it helps us customize the style. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but sometimes it's more like directing or guiding, or there's a few different approaches that we can use. But as long as I know that I'm using high levels of task behavior, I know that I'm using the right style, regardless of the word or the approach that I use. And I'm matching somebody whose performance is low because that's what they need. They need hand-holding, they need guidance. And when we stay away from that two-way conversation, it doesn't mean that the performer is muted. It just means I wouldn't ask someone who doesn't really know what to do, what are their thoughts or how do they think they're going to begin? That's just going to put them in an awkward position. Now, the next style that we're going to build, if you can help me here with the orange box, this is what we call style 2. So again, I'm just going to ask you to focus on the combination of the axis. You'll see this very clearly. We're on the right side, so we continue to provide a lot of that guidance. We're also at the top portion, so that means I simultaneously use a lot of conversation. And here's how it works. If you draw your attention to the bottom part where we see R2, that would be the combination. If somebody's performance for a task is low to moderate, they're probably curious, they have loads of questions, they're asking for guidance, they don't know if they should go right or left, they want to probably see the differences with what we did before, and they want to know why we do it in a certain way. So there's more conversation just because I have a little bit more knowledge around the task. So I still need a lot of guidance, So the approach we use, or the word that we use, or the one that's going to be showing up on the curve, is what we call selling. And it's not that I'm selling a product. It's when I'm using that style, I'm selling a way of doing things in a certain manner. Now, look at this transition, because we're going to start moving to the left. When we move to the left, we're going to see show up this new style, which is what we call style 3. We abbreviate this with S3. It's the blue style. It matches the R3. We see that very intuitive combination of number with number or color with color. And when I use, or when I'm intentional in using style 3, it's because I'm matching someone who's moderate to high. So let's just look at those axes. I'm now on the left side. So that means I'm kind of pulling away from providing all of that task behavior. So it's not no, it's just low. So I may be using a tad of task or directive behavior, but what I'm doing is I'm actually encouraging a lot of conversation. If somebody is performing at a moderate to high level and they're almost there, they don't really need me to walk them through all the specifics. They don't need a lot of direction. What they need is probably to sit down and talk about the what if scenarios. Maybe I had a bad experience with a client. It was a one-time thing, but now it really kind of drained my confidence. And so I need to talk about a few things. Sometimes I want to encourage people. So it's more of that, let's get you to where you need to be, but it's not based on my instruction. It's almost like I'm handing over the task, or I'm almost ready to hand off the task to you. So we call this a participating style, and we call it participating because it's two-way dialogue. But most of what happens is through you, not me doing it for you, which is a very different approach. And then finally, if we look at that last box, it's the pink box. This is where we see style 4 represented, and we're matching someone who's R4 for a task. In other words, their performance is high. That means there isn't an awful lot I'm supposed to be doing except using low levels of relationship, low levels of task behavior. It's not a completely hands-off approach in that I abandon you. It just means I'm not using an awful lot. We'll have a cadence of conversations. We'll touch base. Let's have some touch point meetings. But because your performance is high and I'm honoring that, I want to trust you for this. So the word we use is the delegating approach. And this is really what captures or represents what happens in the style. Now, I could go on and on about the styles. I can tell you there's different little phrases that we use here because we see this also as a communication model. Sometimes S1, we see this as the I talk, I decide approach. Like as a leader, I do most of the talking, I do the deciding. But when we transition to S2, it's more about dialogue. So we talk, but I still decide. And then when we move to S3, just think about this for a moment. We continue to talk, but I want you to decide now. And then when we think about that last one, S4, it's more like you decide, I trust you, not for everything, but for the task. Now, if you can help me here with a click, Andrew, I just want to point out, if you were to think of this model and we split the model in half and we focus on the right side, notice how on the bottom, what we find is that the description of the right side is leader directed. So think about this for a moment. Imagine that we are driving a car, right? And that car is representing a task. If we're on that right side, then as a leader, I'm doing the driving. If I'm operating from that right side, because your performance is low to moderate, you'll be in the car with me, but I'm going to be doing the driving. But if we transition to the left, and again, I'm just going to ask you to draw your attention to the bottom where we see that bracket that says self-directed. Well, things change a little bit because now as a leader, I'm not doing the driving. I may be sitting in the passenger seat. I'm sitting in the back seat. I'm taking a different place. I never abandoned the vehicle, but I'm honoring the fact that your performance is moderate to high or high. And I'll let you do most of that driving, except for when you need to maybe consult with me or, have a conversation with me. So that would be my level of support or the way I can support you for this. Now you see those arrows. Andrew helped us to click on those arrows as well. You see that it's just emphasizing what we said or reiterating what we said. The leadership response that I have is because I'm responding to the needs of that performer for a task. So you see how it's that performer driving that leadership approach. That's why we have those arrows pointing up. So if you can just help me with another click here, Andrew, I want to show you a process that we use to put this model into practice, because I just gave you like a crash course, right? I gave you like the executive summary of what the model is all about. And I love this about this model, that we can spend 8 hours in the room and we can really unpack it, but I can also explain this in 5 minutes to a person. I actually had a teenager the other day that was asking me about some things. They're on their way to get their first job, and I was able to explain this, and like they got it immediately. So the way we put this into practice is represented on the right side, where you see we have 4 steps. Now, the first step is kind of that initial step that we're taking, and it's sort of like the obvious starting point, because we can't really talk about a task-specific model without talking about, let's identify what the task is. Now, please know that when we talk about identifying tasks, it doesn't necessarily mean a technical task. Like if you're thinking of a system, or you're thinking about an Excel spreadsheet that you're working on, or a report that, I mean, that's perfect, but sometimes it means a behavior. So we want to make sure that we're clear on that, identifying that task, and that we have mind share. This model is all about alignment. So let's just make sure that you and I are on the same page and we understand what good looks like. And when we have that, well, kind of a very intuitive place to go to is, now let's assess where you are, or what does your performance readiness look like for the task. Because you can say, I get what the end product looks like, I just don't know how to perform. So that's something that we're going to be finding out. We use what we call a decision tree. That would be something that we would obviously be taking a deeper dive, which we're not going to be doing now. But that assessment is where we're diligent. We're looking for all the signs, the behaviors. We have a very objective process that we put in place. And that will take us to, is the person R1 or R2 or R3 or R4 for the task? And with that, I can then transition to step number 3, which is what you see there. It's matching and communicating now my response. Now, the matching part is the obvious bit. I just gave you the whole formula. It's number with number, it's color with color. So that could be like the obvious thing. But I like to focus, especially when we go through this program all together, the communicate portion is where we get to personalize, where we get to think about how do I make sure that I'm communicating the right message. Andrew, you were saying like one of the big challenges is generational differences, cultural differences. So this is where I get to make all my tweaks and adjustments. And then finally, when we hit step 4, we acknowledge that nobody's needs are going to be static. We're not going to stay there forever. We're always going to be evolving. We either move from right to left, and we call that development, or we move from left to right, and we call that regression. Both of them are pretty much inevitable. Unfortunately, we say that because when people hear regression, it's like, oh, people are going to be backsliding. Yeah, they do. We do backslide for tasks. It's something that will inevitably happen. And thankfully, when we go through the program, we get much better prepared in having these conversations and continue to match a person for where they are. So having said this, here you have it, everybody. This is a situational leadership in a nutshell. Let me just reiterate some of the benefits that we have in applying this. So Andrew, if you can help me with the next slide and final slide here. I think we've talked about some of these items, but just to make sure that we're stressing those points, the first benefit is we remove the temptation of typecasting and bias of a person's or a follower's performance readiness. So when we're thinking about this, we're not putting into categories. We're not saying, oh, this is a top performer. This is, don't give this person anything because they're not a top performer. Like, we remove all of those stereotypes that we sometimes have, or typecasts that we sometimes fall into the temptation of getting into. The second benefit, it's a repeatable process. In other words, we keep on assessing and reapplying the process, especially as we're seeing people change. Now, one of the things here it says is it's not just starting at R1, S1. In other words, we don't acknowledge, or we don't think that everybody is always going to be an R1 for a task and then eventually evolve. I have plenty of people that start off as maybe R2s or R3. So we assess people where they are. We take a snapshot of what their performance looks like right now. And we don't make the assumption that we're always going to be moving in a linear manner. Now, we talked about we lead for tasks, it would be very difficult to just lead for a position. Like if we think about our everyday, we don't lead people just based on their role or based on their position. We really have to get sometimes into the nitty gritty. So that means we need to get into the specific task to understand what the needs are. And then we talk about that same page status or that alignment. That's what really builds the trust. And Andrew, you were speaking to this as well. We want trust. That's one of those challenges as well. We want to make sure that we have that safe place, but it starts off with making sure that we're aligned. When I'm aligned with my leader, as a consequence, trust is built. And then finally, I said this, I mentioned this, but one of the great benefits is that we don't just acknowledge that people develop and my job is done. What happens when things change? What happens when people go through changes in their personal life or professional life or organizational life? I mean, things do change. So how does that impact a person's performance for a task? And that's what we call regression. And we can certainly reverse that. So having said this, Andrew, I'm going to hand it back to you. I'm dying to hear what sorts of questions are coming in, and I'd love to engage in a conversation now and find out what are some of your thoughts and really unpack.
Thanks. Great. Thanks, Jessica. Really useful. In the Q&A, if you could please start populating that with a few of your questions. Let's have a look. Sorry, I muted myself by mistake there. Just so you're aware of what the upcoming programs are. So if you could have a look at those, we've got face-to-face in June in Perth, June in Brisbane, and then, well, all in June, Melbourne and Sydney. And then we're doing some live online. And of course, we do in-house. Quite a lot of our work is done in-house with a management team where we get, 10, 15, 20 supervisors, managers, all in the room together so we can talk about your real issues and share the model with them. So having a look at that, then I've got two questions already that I'd like to share with you, Jessica, from Griselda in Canberra. First one was this. What's the best way to lead a team when the members take information in different ways? Some require more detail, others require a larger picture approach.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that we mentioned is that this model is all about alignment. And when I think about alignment and I think about people's preferences, I see two areas where our model, I think, does a great job in addressing this. And so the first part I would answer to this question is when we think about the task, we actually talk about communication levels that we may use. And this helps us customize a conversation. So sometimes when I'm just understanding what a task looks like and what good looks like, sometimes I don't need an awful lot of information. So I may benefit from just this overall approach. And we call this the forest level. So we can enter by looking at the forest level just because we may have kind of the same level of knowledge around the task. We may come from very similar industries, or maybe I had your job before. Like it's not required to give all that level of specificity. But then sometimes I also see myself for a task requiring a little bit more detail. So we may dive into kind of the opposite side of that, which is the leaf level. This is where we get into the detail. So it's all about making sure that through that conversation, you and I are aligned. So I can tap into your preferences in that step by making sure that we have that mind share. That's the most important thing. We're looking for alignment. But then there's another area, Andrew, where I find that we can certainly appreciate the differences that we have in the preferences. And this is when I start applying my style. So I'll give you a quick example. If I have a preference, right, for big picture information, I don't want all the fluff. I just need a few bullets. Like when I use my style, I can consider that approach from a person and make sure that I'm trying to tweak my communication so that it taps into that. And then there's other people that appreciate, look, they want all the detail, they want all the data. So maybe I can add a few data points or add a few more pieces that would make the whole understanding of whatever we're doing just much more relatable to you based on your preferences. So we tweak that, we customize, we personalize, we can handle basically, or we have the liberty or the freedom of acting in what is required in that conversation or for that person.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. Great answer. Next question from Griselda. How do we get team members on board to an idea, project, initiative where they might not be as interested in the work, but need to do it for regulatory compliance issues?
Yeah. That's another great question from Griselda, I think you mentioned. That sounds like somebody being probably on the right side. It's not always the case, because we're saying on the right side is where typically my performance is low, or it's low to moderate. It may be accompanied by a level of unwillingness or insecurity. Those are some of the words that we use. Sometimes it also happens that I do have kind of this level of understanding of the task and I'm actually performing, but I still feel a little bit insecure or unwilling. So for the most part, we're going to be seeing that right side. I'm not saying it's always, but here's the advantage. When we do the assessment, we're not just looking at a person's ability, we're checking how a person is showing up in terms of their level of confidence and unwillingness. And these are two things that we unpack when we go through our program. Sometimes the resistance or the reluctance comes because it's unknown. I really don't know what to do. As you're saying, things that come from compliance. I see this really often also when things are changing. When we see all these change initiatives, it usually comes accompanied by a whole bunch of new activities as well. And so we work with the person where they are. It addresses that. It addresses a person being reluctant. Sometimes it's because they just don't have the bandwidth. Sometimes it's just a level. It's just a degree of not really kind of understanding how to get to from point A to point B. And we engage in certain ways that we would go through in the program.
Right. Again, Jessica, thank you very much. Look, I've got one here from Lisa, but can I just share one with you as well, one of mine?
Sure.
I've got a client who's got a very senior, very successful manager. He's been in management game for well over 20 years, technically proficient, nice guy, but he's very fixed in his way. He grew up, when he got into management to begin with, he had a very directive manager. He tended to micromanage a bit, and he seems to be stuck in that. For all of his strengths, he seems to be stuck in this. What could we do with someone like that?
Well, we go back to step one. And so we break down what's the area that we want to address, because we're not talking about his performance in general. And you're saying, actually, he's really savvy. He's technically savvy. He's a top performer. There's actually one area where he's not doing such a great job. And that is probably being stuck in his ways. And I don't know what that means, if it's communication with other people or if it's reluctance to change their leadership style. So we pinpoint what's the task. In this case, it could be a behavior. And let's just say this person is coming across with certain arrogance, or, maybe they're a little bit dismissive when it comes to other ideas. Yeah. So we would assess that person based on that task. And then depending on how we identify that task with the behavioral anchors, then we would find out what's their readiness level. And in this case, it sounds like that person would be kind of more on the right side. It seems like their performance is low. They don't seem like they have a lot of ability. They don't seem like they're very confident. Doesn't seem like they're very willing. So I would probably put them there. It sounds like that's the case. And then what I would provide is then direction. So we would do the match depending on where this person is. But the key is, let's find out what the behavior is that we need to address.
Yeah, and I think if they're aware that they're not being assessed overall, this is just for that task, that deals with the trust issue. Yeah, just that task. Great, thank you. I've got a question here from Lisa. So Lisa put her question in the chat. If you want to put your questions in the chat or Q&A, that's fine. Lisa's question was, good question really. What are some effective ways to assess performance readiness?
Lisa, that's a great question. We actually have a whole process for that. And it starts off by really unpacking and understanding the definition of performance readiness. But what we do is basically we shape it into what we call a decision tree that has two very basic questions. And the first one is the person currently performing at a sustained acceptable level? That would be one layer. And then the other layer is this person confident, committed, and motivated? So depending on multiple combinations that we'll get from that will take us to R1, R2, R3, R4. So it's actually a really objective process that we have.
Right. Well, look, any other questions, please, folks? We've got another 5 minutes or so. I happily answered the questions. And obviously, while we've got Jessica here from Mexico, it's a really good opportunity. While we're waiting, Jessica, this links back beautifully to what I was saying before about the large organization I was working with. Imagine what it would be like to have 100 or 200 managers, supervisors, influencers within the organization who had their own individual style, but were able to adapt it. They had a uniform format, a way of approaching each individual. What that would do for trust, what that would do for confidence.
Yeah. And we know that's the starting point, right? That alignment with my leader. If we can agree on the task and we can agree on my assessment and we can agree on the style and we can have that conversation, what this creates is common language. So what happens is when I see organizations that cascade this model all across the different models, we start depersonalizing issues. And I can say, hey, Andrew, I'm actually an R1 for this. I think you're seeing me more of an R2, but I'm actually more of an R1, and we'll talk about all those meanings. But here's what I need from you if that leader is not matching. And as a leader, if I mess up, I'm just one phrase away or one conversation away from making things better. That has happened to me. Like I see someone, I initially thought they were R2, and then I find out they weren't. So I just say in that same conversation, will you excuse me, forgive me? I think I saw you like this, but you're actually like this. Does this seem right?
Yeah.
And then they, oh, yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of
Right.
confirmation going on.
Yeah, and building trust. Look, here's one from me then, another one. Again, really good performer, been a consistently good performer on a specific task for at least 5 years now. And yet his manager has noticed in the last 3 or 4 months, there's been a slide in performance. It's definitely dropped off. He's not sure if it's attitudinal, but there's definitely been a drop or something else is getting in the way, but he's definitely noticed this drop off. How could we apply the model to something like that?
Well, I'm making some assumptions here just based on the brief information that we have. But if this person was performing for the task, right, or for multiple tasks, it seems like this person was R4, their performance was high. But then all of a sudden, I start seeing some changes. So at the very least, there's a little bit of regression and they're going into R3, where now we're seeing more of that sort of moderate to high performance. So it's not completely dead, but it's not as well as it was before. And so usually what changes in those cases is that people become a little bit more unwilling or insecure. And the way we address this is we match with the right style. So if I was matching with an S4 because that person was R4, but now they're showing up as R3, I want to start using S3 style. And that, remember, that's that high communication. It's that high dialogue. So this is going to give me a nice chance to unpack what's going on. There could be issues, personal issues, professional issues, organizational issues. I've been amazed with the information that some people share with me by just engaging in this dialogue. And sometimes I'm so appreciative I had the conversation because it tells me about things that I didn't really notice. And so until I find out, we can problem solve together.
Right. Yeah. If that went even further, would you start seeing things like cynicism? If the performance kept on dropping. Yeah, so if I started noticing a lot of cynicism, so I've had a previously a really good performer that's become quite cynical, or maybe an older performer who's approaching retirement and become a little bit, a little bit soft. Could we apply the model to that?
Yeah, we can. I think, again, we have to go back to the task, and that task is, it could be a behavior. So if this person is being a little bit more cynical, I'm seeing this question here, like passive aggressive, that could be another type of not a very effective behavior. So we can, certainly be working on that behavior. If we pinpoint this is a task, because remember, the task is not just a technical task, it could be that behavior. So there's a couple of things that happen. It all depends on where their readiness is. Sometimes they need a lot of direction. Sometimes they just don't know what it means to continue in that path. And we need to redirect or guide. And it doesn't mean harsh or heavy-handed or anything like that, but it just means this is the expectation. This is what we would like to see. Now, there's always a possibility that people don't want to change. And there's always a possibility this is like an overall behavior, because I'm not saying, or I don't think that situational leadership solves everything, but I do think that it makes probably 90% of those challenges less challenging.
Great, thank you. Look, we have a Q&A question here. Any tips for working with passive-aggressive staff burnt out by previous micromanagement?
Yeah, that's a good one. So again, it's probably reanalyzing where are probably some of those tasks that are draining a person. So I would initially start with that because again, this is kind of like an overall diagnosis, like passive aggressive burnout by previous micromanagement. Well, if that was the case, the best thing we can do is find out what are the tasks, reassess the person, and start applying the different styles. Hopefully that's going to be mitigating some of the effects of what happened before, because now we have a chance of correcting and doing things much better and actually addressing a person where they are. So that micromanagement for a side where they're not really performing is going to be much appreciated. And where they're autonomous or where they're taking charge, then I'm going to be applying a very different style that is going to be conveying the message of I'm letting go. You decide, I trust you.
Yeah, yeah, great. Also, if I can just add a little bit to that question, dealing with the passive aggressive behaviors there, creating an environment of psychological safety where that person feels confident to speak up and talk about what that's been like for them without the fear of, getting into trouble or bad mouthing a current leader, for example, is critical. And so this whole idea of building trust, creating psychological safety, engaging people in dialogue so that they learn how to express themselves clearly, because those passive aggressive behaviors are tough.
Yeah.
It's like they're saying one thing, they're smiling, but underneath they're furious,
Yeah,
and
it's
it can
like
be
grabbing
a
a
bit of a
slippery
challenge.
fish.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I call it plausible deniability. Oftentimes, they'll be quite angry, but they'll pretend they've got a really good reason or that they're quite happy.
Yeah.
Okay, well, look, we're running pretty low on time. We have time for one more question if someone's got something. Looking at the chat, there's nothing else has come up there. No. Okay, well, I think that might be about it then, Jessica, unless there's any final words you have.
No,
I'll
I
take
just
it
want
to
to say thank
a
you.
closing slide. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been, look, it looks like we got something else in the chat. Good, let me go back there. This is from Jacinta. I know, people are just saying that they're going. Sorry, that's all right.
Yeah. And thank you
Yeah,
for
yeah,
that, Jacinta or Jacinta. If you don't have direct reports, definitely this is still for you.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, look, for parents, this is useful. It applies to
Yeah.
any situation, as Jessica said, where you need to influence someone. Could be a parent, could be a friend, but obviously we're in the context of work here. But it's
Yeah.
it's a life skill. A life skill.
Dr. Paul Hersey also used to say this should be a parenting course. Like that's how useful it is
Yeah,
in every aspect of our lives.
yeah, yeah, great. Well, with that said, Jessica, I'd formally like to thank you very much for taking your time out. I know it must be about 9 p.m. in Mexico City, so I do appreciate your commitment and your willingness to help us. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. I'm more than happy. Thank you so, so much for having me here. And thank you for the great questions and the great conversation. So this has been super fun.
Good. And so on behalf of Informa Connect, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. If anyone has anything else, I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes if there are any final questions. But for now, I'll bid you farewell, and hopefully we get to see you somewhere down the track. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.